Well, hello there, and welcome back to A People's Historian. I'm Jason Kishinev, and we are reading about World War II. World War II has just ended, actually. Happy Hanukkah, everybody. But what about fascism as idea, as reality? Were its essential elements, militarism, racism, imperialism, now gone? Or were they absorbed into the already poisoned bones of the victors? A.J. Must, the revolutionary pacifist, had predicted in 1941 the problem after a war is with the victor. He thinks he has just proved that war and violence pay. Who will now teach him a lesson? The victors were the Soviet Union and the United States. Also England, France, and nationalist China, but they were weak. Both these countries now went to work without swastikas, goose-stepping, or officially declared racism, but under the cover of socialism on one side and democracy on the other to carve out their own empires of influence. They proceeded to share and contest with one another the domination of the world, to build military machines far greater than the fascist countries had built, to control the destinies of more countries than Hitler, Mussolini, and Japan had been able to do. They also acted to control their own populations, each country with its own techniques, crude in the Soviet Union, sophisticated in the United States, to make their rule secure. The war not only put the United States in a position to dominate much of the world, it created conditions for effective control at home. The unemployment and economic distress and the consequent turmoil that had marked the 30s, only partly relieved by New Deal measures, had been pacified, overcome by the greater turmoil of the war. The war brought higher prices for farmers, higher wages, enough prosperity for enough of the population to assume against the rebellions that so threatened the 30s. As Lawrence Whitner says, the war rejuvenated American capitalism. The biggest gains were in corporate profits, which rose from $6.4 billion in 1940 to $10.8 billion in 1944. But enough went to workers and farmers to make them feel the system was doing well for them. It was an old lesson learned by governments that war solves problems of control. Charles E. Wilson, the president of General Motors, was so happy about the wartime situation that he suggested a continuing alliance between business and the military for a permanent war economy. That is what happened. When right after the war, the American public, war-weary, seemed to favor demobilization and disarmament, the Truman administration, Roosevelt had died in April 1945, worked to create an atmosphere of crisis and Cold War. True, the rivalry with the Soviet Union was real. That country had come out of the war with its economy wrecked and 20 million people dead, but was making an astounding comeback, rebuilding its industry, regaining military strength. The Truman administration, however, presented the Soviet Union as not just a rival, but an immediate threat. In a series of moves abroad and at home, it established a climate of fear, a hysteria about communism which would steeply escalate the military budget and stimulate the economy with war-related orders. This combination of policies would permit more aggressive actions abroad, more repressive actions at home. Revolutionary movements in Europe and Asia were described to the American public as examples of Soviet expansionism, thus recalling the indignation against Hitler's aggressions. In Greece, which had been a right-wing monarchy and dictatorship before the war, a popular left-wing National Liberation Front, the EAM, was put down by a British Army of Intervention immediately after the war. A right-wing dictatorship was restored. When opponents of the regime were jailed and trade union leaders removed, a left-wing guerrilla movement began to grow against the regime, soon consisting of 17,000 fighters, 50,000 active supporters, and perhaps 250,000 sympathizers in a country of 7 million. Great Britain said it could not handle the rebellion and asked the United States to come in. As a State Department officer said later, Great Britain had within the hour handed the job of world leadership to the United States. The United States responded with the Truman Doctrine, the name given to a speech Truman gave to Congress in the spring of 1947, in which he asked for $400 million in military and economic aid to Greece and Turkey. Truman said the U.S. must help free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. In fact, the biggest outside pressure was the United States. The Greek rebels were getting some aid from Yugoslavia, but no aid from the Soviet Union, which during the war had promised Churchill a free hand in Greece if he would give the Soviet Union its way in Romania, Poland, Bulgaria. The Soviet Union, like the United States, did not seem to be willing to help revolutions it could not control. Truman said the world must choose between alternative ways of life. One was based on the will of the majority, distinguished by free institutions. The other was based on the will of a minority, terror and oppression, the suppression of personal freedoms. Truman's advisor, Clark Clifford, had suggested that in his message, Truman connect the intervention in Greece to something less rhetorical, more practical, the great natural resources of the Middle East. Clifford meant oil. But Truman didn't mention that. The United States moved into the Greek Civil War not with soldiers, but with weapons and military advisors. In the last 5 months of 1947, 74,000 tons of military equipment were sent by the United States to the right-wing government in Athens, including artillery, dive bombers, and stocks of napalm. 250 Army officers, headed by General James Van Fleet, advised the Greek army in the field. Van Fleet started a policy, standard in dealing with popular insurrections, of forcibly removing thousands of Greeks from their homes in the countryside to try to isolate the guerrillas, to remove the source of their support. With that aid, the rebellion was defeated in 1949. United States economic and military aid continued to the Greek government. Investment capital from Esso, Dow Chemical, Chrysler, and other U.S. corporations flowed into Greece, but illiteracy, poverty, and starvation remained widespread there, with the country in the hands of what Richard Barnett called a particularly brutal and backward military dictatorship. In China, a revolution was already underway when World War II ended, led by a communist movement with enormous mass support. A Red Army, which had fought against the Japanese, now fought to oust the corrupt dictatorship of Chiang Kai-shek, which was supported by the United States. The United States, by 1949, had given $2 billion in aid to Chiang Kai-shek's forces, but according to the State Department's own white paper on China, Chiang Kai-shek's government had lost the confidence of his own troops and its own people. In January 1949, Chinese communist forces moved into Peking. The Civil War was over, and China was in the hands of a revolutionary movement, the closest thing in the long history of that ancient country to a people's government independent of outside control. The United States was trying in the post-war decade to create a national consensus, excluding the radicals, who could not support a foreign policy aimed at suppressing revolution, of conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats around the policies of Cold War and anti-communism. Such a coalition could best be created by a liberal democratic president, whose aggressive policy abroad would be supported by conservatives and whose welfare programs at home, Truman's Fair Deal, would be attractive to liberals. If, in addition, liberals and traditional Democrats could, the memory of the war was still fresh, support a foreign policy against aggression, the radical liberal bloc created by World War II would be broken up, and perhaps, if the anti-communist mood became strong enough, liberals could support repressive moves at home, which in ordinary times would be seen as violating the liberal tradition of tolerance. In 1950, there came an event that speeded the formation of the liberal-conservative consensus: Truman's undeclared war in undeclared war in Korea. Korea, occupied by Japan for 35 years, was liberated from Japan after World War II and divided into North Korea, a socialist dictatorship, part of the Soviet sphere of influence, and South Korea, a right-wing dictatorship in the American sphere. There had been threats back and forth between the two Koreas, and when, on June 25, 1950, North Korean armies moved forward across the 38th parallel in an invasion of South Korea, the United Nations, dominated by the United States, asked its members to help repel the armed attack. Truman ordered the American armed forces to help South Korea, and the American Army became the UN Army. Truman said, "A return to the role of force in international affairs would have far-reaching effects. The United States will continue to uphold the rule of law." The United States' response to the rule of force was to reduce Korea, North and South, to a shambles. In 3 years of bombing and shelling, napalm was dropped, and a BBC journalist described the result. "In front of us a curious figure was standing, a little crouched, legs straddled, arms held out from his sides. He had no eyes, and the whole of his body, nearly all of which was visible through tatters of burnt rags, was covered with a hard black crust speckled with yellow pus. He had to stand, because he was no longer covered with the skin, but with the crust-like cracking which broke easily. I thought of the hundreds of villages reduced to ash which I personally had seen, and realized the sort of casualty list which must be mounting up along the Korean front. Perhaps 2 million Koreans, North and South, were killed in the Korean War, all in the name of opposing the rule of force. As for the rule of law Truman spoke about, the American military moves seemed to go beyond that. The UN resolution had called for action to repel the armed attack and to restore peace and security in the area. But the American armies, after pushing the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel, advanced all the way up through North Korea to the Yalu River on the border of China, which provoked the Chinese into entering the war. The Chinese then swept southward, and the war was stalemated at the 38th parallel until peace negotiations restored in 1953 the old boundary between North and South. The Korean War mobilized liberal opinion behind the war and the president. It created the kind of coalition that was needed to sustain a policy of intervention abroad, militarization of the economy at home. This meant trouble for those who stayed outside the coalition as radical critics. Alonzo Hamby noted that the Korean War was supported by the New Republic, by the Nation, and by Henry Wallace, who in 1948 had run against Truman on a left coalition Progressive Party ticket. The liberals didn't like Senator Joseph McCarthy, who hunted for communists everywhere, even among liberals, But the Korean War, as Hamby says, had given McCarthyism a new lease on life. The left had become very influential in the hard times of the 30s and during the war against fascism. The actual membership of the Communist Party was not large, fewer than 100,000 probably, but it was a potent force in trade unions numbering millions of members, in the arts, and among countless Americans who may have been led by the failure of the capitalist system in the 30s to look favorably on communism and socialism. Thus, if the establishment after World War II was to make capitalism more secure in the country and to build a consensus of support for the American empire, it had to weaken and isolate the left. 2 weeks after presenting to the country the Truman Doctrine for Greece and Turkey, Truman issued on March 22, 1947, Executive Order 9835, initiating a program to search out any infiltration of disloyal persons in the U.S. government. In their book, The 50s, Douglas Miller and Marion Nowak comment, though Truman would later complain of the great wave of hysteria sweeping the nation, his commitment to victory over communism, to completely safeguarding the United States from external and internal threats, was in large measure responsible for creating that very hysteria. Between the launching of his security program in March 1947 and December 1952, some 6.6 million persons were investigated. Not a single case of espionage was uncovered, though about 500 persons were dismissed in dubious cases of questionable loyalty. All of this was conducted with secret evidence, secret and often paid informers, and neither judge nor jury. Despite the failure to find subversion, the broad scope of the official Red Hunt gave popular credence to the notion that the government was riddled with spies. A conservative and fearful reaction coursed the country. Americans became convinced of the need for absolute security and the preservation of the established order. World events right after the war made it easier to build up public support for the anti-communist crusade at home. In 1948, the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia ousted non-communists from the government and established their own rule. The Soviet Union that year blockaded Berlin, which was a jointly occupied city isolated inside the Soviet sphere of East Germany, forcing the United States to airlift supplies into Berlin. In 1949, there was the communist victory in China, and in that year also, the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb. In 1950, the Korean War began. These were all portrayed to the public as signs of a world communist conspiracy. Not as publicized as the communist victories, but just as disturbing to the American government was the upsurge all over the world of colonial peoples demanding independence. Revolutionary movements were growing in Indochina against the French, in Indonesia against the Dutch, in the Philippines, armed rebellion against the United States. In Africa, there were rumblings of discontent in the form of strikes. Basil Davidson tells of the longest recorded strike in African history, 160 days, of 19,000 railwaymen in French West Africa in 1947, whose message to the Governor General showed the new mood of militancy. Open your prisons, make ready your machine guns and cannons. Nevertheless, at midnight on the 10th of October, if our demands are not met, we declare the general strike. The year before, in South Africa, 100,000 gold mine workers stopped work, demanding 10 shillings, about $2.50 a day in wages, the greatest strike in the history of South Africa, and it took a military attack to get them back to work. In 1950 in Kenya, there was a general strike against starvation wages. So it was not just Soviet expansion that was threatening to the United States government and to American business interests. In fact, China, Korea, Indochina, the Philippines represented local communist movements, not Russian fomentation. It was a general wave of anti-imperialist insurrection in the world, which would require gigantic American effort to defeat, national unity for militarization of the budget, for the suppression of domestic opposition to such a foreign policy. Truman and the liberals in Congress proceeded to try to create a new national unity for the post-war years with the executive order on loyalty oaths, Justice Department prosecutions, and anti-communist legislation. In this atmosphere, Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin could go even farther than Truman. Speaking to a women's Republican club in Wheeling, West Virginia in the early 1950s, he held up some papers and shouted, "I have here in my hand a list of 205, a list of names that were made known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party and who nevertheless are still working and shaping policy in the State Department." The next day, speaking in Salt Lake City, McCarthy claimed he had a list of 57. The number kept changing. Such communists in the State Department. Shortly afterward, he appeared on the floor of the Senate with photostatic copies of about 100 dossiers from State Department loyalty files. The dossiers were 3 years old, and most of the people were no longer with the State Department. But McCarthy read from them anyway, inventing, adding, and changing as he read. In one case, he changed the dossier's description of liberal to communistically inclined. In another form, active fellow traveler to active communist, and so on. McCarthy kept on like this for the next few years. As chairman of the Permanent Investigations Subcommittee of a Senate Committee on Government Operations, he investigated the State Department's information program, its Voice of America, and its overseas libraries, which included books by people McCarthy considered communists. The State Department reacted in panic, issuing a stream of directives to its library centers across the world. 40 books were removed, including the selected works of Thomas Jefferson, edited by Philip Foner, and The Children's Hour by Lillian Hellman. Some books were burned. McCarthy became bolder. In the spring of 1954, he began hearings to investigate supposed subversives in the military. When he began attacking generals for not being hard enough on suspected communists, he antagonized Republicans as well as Democrats, and in December 1954, the Senate voted overwhelmingly to censure him for conduct unbecoming a member of the United States Senate. The censure resolution avoided criticizing McCarthy's anti-communist lies and exaggerations. It concentrated on minor matters, on his refusal to appear before a Senate subcommittee on privileges in elections, and his abuse on an Army general at his hearings. At the very time the Senate was censuring McCarthy, Congress was putting through a whole series of anti-communist bills. Liberal Hubert Humphrey introduced an amendment to one of them to make the Communist Party illegal, saying, "I do not intend to be a half-patriot. Either senators are for recognizing the Communist Party for what it is, or they will continue to trip over the niceties of legal technicalities and details." The liberals in the government were themselves acting to exclude, persecute, fire, and even imprison communists. It was just that McCarthy had gone too far, attacking not only communists but liberals, endangering that broad liberal conservative coalition which was considered essential. For instance, Lyndon Johnson, a Senate minority leader, worked not only to pass the censure resolution on McCarthy, but also to keep it within the narrow bounds of conduct unbecoming a member of the United States Senate, rather than questioning McCarthy's anti-communism. John F. Kennedy was cautious on the issue, didn't speak out against McCarthy. He was absent when the censure vote was taken and never said how he would have voted. McCarthy's insistence that communism had won in China because of softness on communism in the American government was close to Kennedy's own view. Expressed in the House of Representatives, January 1949, when the Chinese communists took over Peking, Kennedy said, "Mr. Speaker, over this weekend we have learned the extent of the disaster that has befallen China and the United States." Forgive my JFK impression. "The responsibility for the failure of our foreign policy in the Far East rests squarely with the White House and the Department of State." The continued insistence that aid would not be forthcoming unless a coalition government with the communists was formed was a crippling blow to the nationalist government. So concerned were our diplomats and their advisors, the Lattimores and the Fairbanks, both scholars in the field of Chinese history. Owen Lattimore, a favorite target of McCarthy, John Fairbank, a Harvard professor, with the imperfection of the democratic system in China, after 20 years of war and the tales of corruption to high places, that they lost sight of our tremendous stake in a non-communist China. The House must now assume the responsibility of preventing the onrushing tide of communism from engulfing all of Asia. Yeah, it's a bad JFK impression. When in 1950 Republicans sponsored an Internal Security Act for the registration of organizations found to be Communist Action or Communist Front, liberal senators did not fight that head on. Instead, some of them, including Hubert Humphrey and Herbert Lehman, proposed a substitute measure, the setting up of detention centers, really concentration camps for suspected subversives, who, when the president declared an internal security emergency, would be held without trial. The detention camp bill became not a substitute for, but an addition to, the Internal Security Act, and the proposed camps were set up, ready for use. In 1968, a time of general disillusionment with anti-communism, this law was repealed. Truman's executive order on loyalty in 1947 required the Department of Justice to draw up a list of organizations it decided were totalitarian, fascist, communist, or subversive, or as seeking to alter the form of government of the United States by unconstitutional means. Not only membership in, but also sympathetic association with any organization on the Attorney General's list would be considered in determining disloyalty. By 1954, there were hundreds of groups on the list, including, besides the Communist Party and the Ku Klux Klan, the Chopin Cultural Center, the Cervantes Fraternal Society, the Committee for the Negro in the Arts, the Committee for the Protection of the Bill of Rights, the League of American Writers, the Nature Friends of America, People's Drama, the Washington Bookshop Association, and the Yugoslav Seamen's Club. It was not McCarthy and the Republicans, but the liberal, democratic Truman administration, whose Justice Department initiated a series of prosecutions that intensified the nation's anti-communist mood. The most important of these was the prosecution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in the summer of 1950. And I'm going to go ahead and stop there. I hope you are enjoying the reading. Please remember to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell because YouTube has been known to unsubscribe people. And tune in next time, and hopefully we're going to finish chapter 16. Thank you very much.